This is my true story. My son threw me out of his house after I embarrassed him in front of his wealthy dinner guests by coming downstairs for my heart medication. He screamed at me to pack my things and get out immediately. He physically pushed me out the door with 2 garbage bags of my belongings and no money. I spent 4 days on the streets begging strangers for food scraps and sleeping under highway. Every bite I ate tasted like shame. Then on day 4, I made 1 phone call to my lawyer, and everything changed. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. I raised my son completely alone from the time he was 3 years old, after his mother abandoned us without warning or explanation. She just left one day while I was at work and never came back. I became a single father overnight with no idea how to raise a child by myself while also trying to build a career and provide financially. I worked myself nearly to death over the following decades, building a successful consulting firm from absolutely nothing, so my son could have everything I never had growing up poor. I wanted him to have opportunities and advantages that would set him up for success in life. I put him through the best private schools in the state, even though the tuition was astronomical and ate up most of my income. I hired tutors when he struggled with subjects. I paid for expensive extracurricular activities and sports programs. I saved every penny I could scrape together to send him to an Ivy League university where he could network with wealthy, connected people and get the kind of education that opens doors. I paid his full tuition without loans so he could graduate debt-free and start his adult life with a clean financial slate. Every sacrifice I made was for him and his future. When he graduated, I made him vice president of my consulting company at only 30 years old, which was an incredibly generous position for someone so young with limited real-world experience. I gave him a salary that was far higher than what he deserved based on his actual contributions to the business. That salary allowed him to buy a mansion in an exclusive neighborhood. It allowed him to drive luxury cars and wear expensive clothes and take elaborate vacations. It gave him a lifestyle that most people only dream about having. He lived like a millionaire because I was paying him like one even though he hadn't earned it. I thought every sacrifice I'd made over the years had been worth it when I watched my son become successful and wealthy and respected in his field. I felt proud seeing him living the life I'd worked so hard to give him. I thought he appreciated what I'd done for him, even if he didn't say it directly. I thought the struggles we'd overcome together when he was young had bonded us in a way that money and success couldn't break. I was completely wrong about all of that. As his wealth grew and his lifestyle became more extravagant, his patience with me shrank proportionally. Success changed him into someone I didn't recognize anymore. The humble, grateful son who used to appreciate everything I did for him disappeared and was replaced by an arrogant, entitled man who seemed embarrassed by his own father. He started making comments about my old-fashioned ways and how I didn't understand the modern business world. He criticized my worn clothes, saying I dressed like a poor person and it reflected badly on him. He got annoyed when I told stories about the struggles we'd overcome together when he was young, because those stories reminded his wealthy friends that he hadn't always been rich. The breaking point came when I had a minor heart attack at 78 years old. Nothing too serious, but scary enough that my doctor said I shouldn't be living alone anymore in case something worse happened. My son reluctantly agreed to let me move into his mansion, saying he had plenty of space in the guest wing. But from the moment I moved in, his resentment became impossible to hide or ignore. He treated me like an unwanted burden he was stuck with, rather than the father who'd sacrificed everything to give him the life he was now living. He made it very clear through his words and actions that having me in his house was a massive inconvenience that he tolerated only out of obligation. Living in my son's mansion was nothing like I'd imagined it would be when he first offered to let me move in after my heart attack. I thought we'd spend time together and reconnect after years of him being busy with his career and social life. I thought maybe he'd appreciate having his father around to talk to and share meals with. Instead, he made it abundantly clear from day one that I was an embarrassment he needed to hide from his new wealthy social circle. He started making rules about when I could use certain parts of the house and when I needed to stay in my room out of sight. When he hosted dinner parties or business meetings at the house, he would make me eat my meals separately in my room, like I was some kind of servant who wasn't allowed at the table with the important guests. He'd bring me a plate of food and tell me to stay upstairs until everyone left because he didn't want me around his colleagues and clients. When people would ask if anyone else lived in the house, he'd introduce me vaguely as just the old man who lives here without even acknowledging I was his father. He acted like I was hired help or some random boarder rather than the person who'd raised him alone and built the company that funded his entire lifestyle. He criticized everything about me constantly. My clothes were too old and worn and made him look bad by association. My stories about our struggles when he was young were embarrassing, and he didn't want me sharing them with anyone. My medication routine was inconvenient and disruptive to the household schedule. My need for regular doctor appointments was annoying because sometimes he had to arrange transportation for me. Even my presence in common areas of the house seemed to irritate him. He'd walk into the living room and visibly sigh when he saw me sitting there reading or watching television, like I was ruining his space just by existing in it. His wife was even worse than he was about making me feel unwelcome and burdensome. She'd make passive-aggressive comments about how crowded the house felt with 3 adults living there, even though the mansion had 8 bedrooms, and I only occupied 1 small guest room. She'd complain that my medications made the upstairs smell like a pharmacy, and it bothered her when she walked past my room. She'd schedule cleaning services to come specifically to my room multiple times per week, like I was somehow dirtier or messier than anyone else in the house, even though I kept my space immaculate. The worst part was watching my son agree with her complaints and take her side against me in every disagreement or conflict. When she'd say something cruel about me being in the way, he'd nod along and tell me I needed to be more considerate of their space and their lifestyle. When she'd suggest I should maybe look into senior living facilities where I'd be around people my own age, he wouldn't defend me or shut down that suggestion. He'd just shrug and say maybe that wasn't a bad idea to consider for the future. The man I'd sacrificed everything for was actively looking for ways to get rid of me. I started spending most of my time in my room just to avoid the tension and hostility that filled the house whenever I was around them. I'd eat my meals alone. I'd watch television with the volume low so I wouldn't disturb anyone. I'd try to make myself as small and invisible as possible, hoping that would make them resent me less. But nothing I did was ever enough. My very existence in that house was an affront to the image my son wanted to project to his wealthy friends and business associates. I was a reminder that he'd come from humble, struggling beginnings, and he wanted to erase that part of his history completely. Last Friday evening, my son's wife was hosting an important dinner party at the house for some of his wealthiest clients and their spouses. She'd been planning this event for weeks and had hired professional caterers and decorators to make everything perfect. The day of the party, my son came to my room in the afternoon and told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to stay in my room for the entire evening. He said these were very important people who could make or break major business deals, and he couldn't afford to have anything go wrong. He specifically said he didn't want me coming downstairs or interacting with the guests because I might embarrass them in front of these influential people. I agreed to stay in my room, even though it hurt to be treated like some shameful secret that needed to be hidden away. I went upstairs around 5 in the evening before the guests started arriving and stayed there reading a book and trying to ignore the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting up from downstairs. But around 8 o'clock, I realized I'd forgotten to bring my evening heart medication up to my room with me. It was sitting in the kitchen where I always kept it so I wouldn't forget to take it with dinner. My doctor had been very clear that I needed to take this medication at the same time every day, and missing doses could be dangerous given my recent heart attack. I debated just skipping the dose to avoid going downstairs, but I knew that was a bad idea health-wise. So I quietly opened my door and went down the stairs as carefully as possible, hoping I could slip into the kitchen, grab my medication, and get back upstairs without anyone noticing I'd left my room. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs and started walking toward the kitchen, I came face to face with the entire dinner party. They were all standing in the hallway between the dining room and the living room, holding wine glasses and having some kind of conversation. Everyone turned to look at me standing there in my casual clothes and slippers, looking completely out of place at this elegant event. My son's face flushed bright red with rage and humiliation as his important guests stared at me with confused expressions, clearly wondering who this old man was and why he was wandering around during their exclusive dinner party. His wife looked absolutely mortified, like I'd just committed the worst possible social transgression. I tried to quickly explain that I just needed to get my heart medication from the kitchen and then I'd go right back upstairs. But my son cut me off before I could finish my sentence and told me very loudly in front of everyone to just go back to my room immediately and he'd bring me whatever I needed later. I retreated back upstairs, completely humiliated, while the guests whispered among themselves about what had just happened. I could hear my son and his wife making excuses and apologizing for the interruption. After the guests finally left around 11 that night, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My door flew open, and my son stood there with a look of pure fury on his face that I'd never seen before. He started screaming at me about how I'd ruined his entire evening and embarrassed him in front of the most important clients his company had. He said I'd specifically been told to stay in my room, and I couldn't even follow one simple instruction. I tried to explain about my medication, but he didn't want to hear it. He screamed that he was done with me and couldn't take this anymore. He said I ruined everything and he wanted me out of his house immediately. He went to my closet and grabbed 2 large garbage bags and started throwing them at me. He told me to pack my things right now and get out. When I said I had nowhere to go at 10 o'clock at night, he said he didn't care and that wasn't his problem anymore. He physically grabbed my arm and started pushing me toward the door, telling me to get my stuff and leave his house before he called the police and had me removed for trespassing. I was literally thrown out onto my son's driveway at 10 o'clock at night, with 2 garbage bags hastily stuffed with whatever clothes and belongings I could grab in the 15 minutes he'd given me to pack. I didn't even have my wallet because it was still sitting on my dresser inside the house, and when I knocked on the door, asking if I could please come back in to get it, my son screamed through the door that I was trespassing on his property, and if I didn't leave immediately, he'd call the police. I stood there on his driveway at 78 years old, with a bad heart and no money, and nowhere to go, while he turned off the porch lights and left me in darkness. I started walking because I didn't know what else to do. I walked for maybe an hour just trying to get away from his neighborhood before someone called the police on me for being a suspicious person wandering around at night. Eventually, I found myself near a highway overpass, and I crawled under it with my 2 garbage bags and tried to find a spot that wasn't too dirty or wet to sit down. That first night was the longest night of my entire life. The ground was hard and cold. The traffic noise from the highway above was constant and deafening. Other homeless people were nearby, and some of them looked dangerous or mentally unstable. I didn't sleep at all, just sat there shivering and trying to process that my own son had done this to me. The next morning I was hungry and thirsty and had no money to buy food. I walked to a park where there was a public water fountain and drank as much as I could. Then I sat on a bench trying to figure out what to do. I had no identification without my wallet. I had no money. I had no phone charger, and my phone was at 20% battery. I couldn't call anyone for help because I was too ashamed to explain that my son had thrown me out like garbage. I just sat there on that park bench watching people walk by with their coffees and breakfast sandwiches while my stomach cramped with hunger. By the afternoon of that second day, I was desperate enough to start begging. I found a busy intersection near some restaurants, and I held out my hand asking people for spare change or food. Most people ignored me completely, walking past like I was invisible. Some people looked at me with disgust or pity but didn't stop. A few people gave me dollar bills or loose change. After several hours of begging, I had maybe $6, which I used to buy a small sandwich from a gas station. That sandwich was the first food I'd eaten in almost 2 full days, and I devoured it in about 30 seconds standing outside the gas station. The third night, I slept in the park on a bench because I was too exhausted to walk back to the highway overpass. Someone stole one of my garbage bags while I was sleeping, so I lost half of what little I had left. The fourth day, I was so weak from hunger and lack of sleep that I could barely stand up. I found a piece of cardboard in a dumpster and wrote on it with a marker someone had thrown away. The sign said, "Please help, 78 years old and hungry." I sat outside a restaurant holding that sign, feeling shame so deep it was almost physical pain. People walked past me going into the restaurant to eat expensive meals while I begged for their scraps. A restaurant employee eventually came out and gave me a container of leftover food that someone hadn't finished. I ate cold pasta and half-eaten bread rolls sitting on the curb behind the restaurant. Every bite tasted like humiliation. Every moment of those 4 days felt like I was dying slowly. My son had reduced me to this. The man I'd raised and sacrificed everything for had thrown me away and left me to starve on the streets. On the morning of day 4, sitting on that curb behind the restaurant eating discarded food, I felt weaker than I'd ever felt in my entire 78 years of life. My body was shutting down from lack of proper food and sleep and the constant stress and exposure to cold temperatures at night. My heart was doing strange things in my chest that scared me. I knew if I spent another night on the streets, there was a real possibility I would die out here alone and forgotten while my son lived in his mansion pretending I didn't exist. That thought should have made me sad, but mostly, I just felt angry that it had come to this. I reached into my jacket pocket to check my phone battery and realized I still had the device with me, even though it was down to 8% power. Over the past few days, I'd been charging it for short periods at public libraries when I could get inside during their open hours. I'd sit at a table pretending to read books while my phone was plugged into an outlet under the table, slowly regaining some battery life. It was the only possession I had left that connected me to my old life before my son threw me away. I'd been avoiding using it because I didn't want to waste the battery on calls that wouldn't help my situation. But sitting there weak and hungry and knowing I might not survive much longer, I looked at that phone and realized it could end this nightmare with a single call. I had numbers in my contacts for people who could help me, people who didn't know what my son had done, people who would be horrified if they found out I'd been sleeping under highway overpasses and begging for food. Part of me still hesitated to make that call because some pathetic part of me still loved my son, despite everything he'd done. Some part of me didn't want to destroy him, even though he'd destroyed me without any hesitation. I sat there for probably 20 minutes just staring at my phone trying to decide what to do. I thought about calling one of my old friends and asking if I could stay with them for a while. But that felt humiliating, and I'd have to explain what happened and admit that my son had thrown me out. I thought about calling social services and asking about shelter options for homeless seniors. But the idea of going into the system and living in some facility felt like giving up completely. Then I thought about calling my attorney Marcus, who'd been my lawyer for over 20 years and handled all my business and personal legal matters. Marcus didn't know what my son had done to me. Marcus thought I was living comfortably in my son's mansion because that's what I'd told him the last time we spoke months ago. But Marcus also knew things about my business and my assets that my son had apparently forgotten or never fully understood. Marcus knew the real structure of the company that was funding my son's lifestyle. Marcus knew who actually owned what and who had control over the money that made everything possible. If anyone could help me right now and also make my son pay for what he'd done, it would be Marcus. I opened my contacts and scrolled to his name. My finger hovered over the call button while I made my final decision. This would change everything. This would destroy my son's life the way he'd destroyed mine. Once I made this call, there would be no going back, and no forgiveness, and no reconciliation. Our relationship, such as it was, would be permanently over. But then I looked down at the container of half-eaten leftover food I'd been given like charity. I looked at my dirty clothes and my garbage bag of possessions. I thought about 4 days of sleeping on concrete and begging strangers for money and feeling like I wanted to die. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear. Marcus answered on the second ring. Marcus answered the phone immediately, and the relief in his voice was obvious even through the bad connection on my dying phone. "Mr. Richardson? Thank God you called. I've been trying to reach you for days. I called your cell phone multiple times, but it kept going to voicemail. I even tried calling your son's house, but he told me you'd gone traveling and were unreachable for a while. He said you were taking some kind of vacation and didn't want to be disturbed. Where are you? Are you all right? You don't sound good." I started crying the moment I heard his concerned voice asking if I was okay. I hadn't cried once during the 4 days on the streets because I'd been too focused on survival and too angry to let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. But hearing someone who actually cared about my well-being after days of being treated like garbage broke something inside me. I tried to speak, but the words came out choked and broken. Marcus immediately knew something was very wrong and told me to take my time and tell him what happened. He said he had all day and I should start from the beginning. I told him everything through tears and exhaustion. I told him about living in my son's house and being treated like an embarrassment. I told him about the dinner party where I came downstairs for my heart medication and humiliated my son in front of his important clients. I told him about being screamed at and physically pushed out the door with garbage bags at 10 o'clock at night. I told him about 4 days of sleeping under highway overpasses and in parks. I told him about begging for food outside restaurants and eating discarded leftovers from strangers' plates. I told him about holding a cardboard sign that said I was 78 years old and hungry. I told him everything and didn't leave out any of the shameful, degrading details. The silence on the other end of the phone after I finished talking was heavy and filled with what I could only describe as cold fury. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had changed completely from concerned to absolutely enraged. "Where are you right now? Give me your exact location. I'm leaving my office immediately, and I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't move from wherever you are. And Mr. Richardson, listen to me very carefully. We are ending this today. Your son has no idea what he just did to himself. He thinks he threw out his embarrassing father. He actually just destroyed his entire life." I gave Marcus the address of the restaurant where I was sitting, and he told me again not to move, and he'd be there as fast as possible. He said when he arrived we were going straight to his office, and he was going to remind me of some very important facts about my business that my son had apparently forgotten. He said my son was about to learn a very expensive lesson about gratitude and loyalty, and what happens when you throw away the person who gave you everything. The anger in Marcus's voice was almost scary, but also comforting, because it meant someone was finally on my side after 4 days of being completely alone. I sat on that curb for exactly 18 minutes before Marcus's car pulled up. He got out, and when he saw me sitting there dirty and unshaven in wrinkled clothes holding a garbage bag, his face went pale with shock. He'd known me for 20 years and had never seen me look anything less than put together and professional. Seeing me reduced to this clearly affected him deeply. He helped me into his car and didn't say anything for the first few minutes of the drive. Then he said very quietly that what my son had done was unforgivable, and that he was going to help me make sure my son understood exactly what he'd lost. Marcus drove me to his office and brought me to a private bathroom where I could clean myself up. He'd stopped at a store on the way and bought me new clothes so I wouldn't have to wear the dirty things I'd been sleeping in for 4 days. After I'd showered and changed and looked somewhat human again, he brought me to his office and ordered food to be delivered because he knew I hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. While we waited for the food to arrive, he pulled out files from his cabinet and spread them across his desk. These were files containing documents about my business and its ownership structure. He reminded me of something that my son had apparently conveniently forgotten or perhaps never fully understood in the first place. The consulting company that my son was vice president of, and the company that paid his enormous salary, and the company that funded his mansion and his luxury cars and his entire lifestyle was not actually his company at all. I still owned 85% of it. I had always owned 85% of it since I founded the business over 30 years ago. My son owned nothing. He was just an employee with a fancy title and a generous paycheck. Marcus explained that when I'd made my son vice president and given him significant operational control over the day-to-day running of the business, I had never actually transferred ownership to him. I'd planned to do that eventually through my will when I died. I'd wanted him to inherit the company and continue building on what I'd created. But I had never gotten around to actually executing the legal documents that would have transferred my shares to him. The ownership structure had remained exactly as it was when I founded the company. My name on 85% of the shares. A few early investors holding the remaining 15%. My son's name nowhere on any ownership documents. This meant that legally, my son was just a highly paid employee working for a company that I owned and controlled. He had no claim to the business beyond his salary and his job title. I was still the chairman of the board of directors, even though I'd stepped back from active leadership years ago to let my son run things. I still had the power to make any decisions I wanted about the company, including decisions about personnel and compensation and strategic direction. My son had been living under the illusion that this was his company and his success, when in reality, everything he had was dependent on me allowing him to keep his position. Marcus pointed out that this gave me enormous leverage if I chose to use it. He said I could fire my son from his position effective immediately, and there would be nothing my son could do about it legally. I could terminate his salary, which would mean he'd have no income to support his expensive lifestyle. I could resume active control of the company and redirect its resources however I saw fit. I could essentially take back everything I'd given my son with a few signatures and phone calls. The power had always been mine. I'd just chosen not to exercise it because I'd trusted my son and wanted him to feel like he'd earned his success. But my son had thrown me out of his house and left me to beg for food on the streets for 4 days. He'd treated me like garbage that needed to be disposed of. He'd been ashamed of me and hidden me away from his important friends. He'd physically pushed me out the door with no money and no plan, and no concern for whether I lived or died out there. That kind of betrayal and cruelty didn't deserve mercy or second chances. That kind of treatment from the son I'd sacrificed everything for deserved consequences that would teach him exactly what he'd lost when he threw away his father. Marcus asked me what I wanted to do with this information. He said it was my decision and he'd support whatever choice I made. But he also said that if I did nothing, my son would continue treating me terribly and would never learn that actions have consequences. I sat in Marcus's office looking at the ownership documents spread across his desk and thinking about my son living comfortably in his mansion while I'd been sleeping under a highway overpass eating garbage. I thought about him telling his dinner guests that I was just the old man who lived there without acknowledging I was his father. I thought about him screaming that he was done with me and physically shoving me out the door. I thought about 4 days of hunger and cold and shame and fear. Then I looked at Marcus and told him I wanted to destroy everything my son had built on the foundation I'd provided. I wanted him to lose it all the way I'd lost everything when he threw me away. Marcus nodded and said he'd been hoping I would make that choice because what my son did was unforgivable and needed serious consequences. He picked up his office phone and told me we were calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors right now. I was still the chairman of the board, even though I hadn't attended a meeting in over 2 years since stepping back from daily operations. The board consisted of 6 members, including myself and the early investors who owned the remaining 15% of the company. Marcus started making calls to each board member, explaining that I was calling an emergency session and needed everyone available immediately, either in person or by conference call. Within an hour, we had all 6 board members on the line, or sitting in Marcus's conference room. They were clearly concerned about why I was calling this meeting so suddenly after being largely absent from company operations for years. Some of them asked if something was wrong with the business, or if there was some kind of crisis they needed to know about. I told them there was indeed a crisis, but it wasn't about the business performance. It was about my son and his position within the company. Then I explained to them exactly what had happened over the past 4 days. I told the board that my son had thrown me out of his house at 78 years old with a bad heart and no money. I told them he'd left me to sleep on the streets and beg for food like a homeless person with nowhere else to go. I told them he'd been treating me like an embarrassment for months before finally discarding me completely when I accidentally interrupted his dinner party. I could hear shocked gasps and angry murmurs from the board members as I described my 4 days of hell. These were people who'd known me for decades and respected me as the founder of the company. Hearing that my own son had done this to me clearly horrified them. Then I made my announcement in a clear, firm voice that left no room for debate or discussion. Effective immediately, I am terminating my son's employment with this company and removing him from all positions and titles he currently holds. He is no longer vice president. He is no longer an employee. His access to company resources and his salary are terminated as of right now. I am also resuming active leadership of the company as chairman and CEO until we can find a suitable replacement for the operational role my son was filling. This decision is final, and I'm exercising my rights as majority owner to make these changes without requiring board approval." There was silence on the conference line for maybe 10 seconds as the board members processed what I'd just said. Then one by one they spoke up expressing their support for my decision. They said what my son had done was absolutely inexcusable, and they fully supported my right to remove him from the company. They said they were horrified by how he'd treated me and agreed he didn't deserve the position or the generous compensation he'd been receiving. One board member said my son had always been arrogant and difficult to work with, and this just confirmed his true character. Another said she'd be happy to see him gone and looked forward to working with me directly again. The vote was unanimous. My son was fired from the company effective immediately. His career and his income and the foundation of his entire lifestyle disappeared with one phone call. Marcus handled all the logistics of terminating my son's employment with brutal efficiency that same afternoon. He contacted the company's head of security and human resources and instructed them to immediately deactivate my son's employee credentials and building access. He had IT shut down my son's company email account and remove his access to all internal systems and databases. He drafted a formal termination letter that was delivered to my son at his home by courier service, citing his removal from all positions effective immediately with no severance package or benefits continuation. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, my son's entire professional identity had been erased from the company he thought he'd been running. Security was sent to escort my son from the building when he showed up for work the next Monday morning, not yet having fully processed what had happened. Apparently, he'd received the termination letter over the weekend, but had assumed it was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding that he could clear up by going to the office. Instead, he was met at the front entrance by 2 security guards who told him he was no longer employed there and needed to leave the premises immediately. They escorted him to his office, where he was given 15 minutes to pack his personal belongings into a box while they watched. Then they walked him out to the parking lot and told him not to return. Without his enormous salary, my son's financial situation collapsed almost immediately. He'd been making over $400,000 per year as vice president, which had allowed him to live far beyond what most people could afford. But he'd never saved any of that money because he'd assumed the income would continue indefinitely. He'd bought the mansion with a mortgage that required payments of over $8,000 per month. He'd leased 2 luxury cars with combined payments of around $3,000 per month. He had country club memberships and expensive insurance policies and credit cards with huge balances that he'd been paying off with his salary. When that salary stopped coming, all of those financial obligations became impossible to meet. His first mortgage payment bounced within 2 weeks of his termination. The bank sent him default notices and started foreclosure proceedings after the second missed payment. His car leases went into default, and the leasing company repossessed both vehicles right out of his driveway. His country club membership was canceled when his automatic payment failed. His credit cards went into collections when he couldn't make the minimum payments. Within 2 months of losing his job, my son went from living like a millionaire to facing bankruptcy and homelessness. His wife, who'd been perfectly happy to have me eating separately in my room and hiding from dinner guests, filed for divorce the moment she realized the money was gone and wasn't coming back. She took their 2 children and whatever assets remained that weren't already seized by creditors. She moved in with her parents and hired an aggressive divorce lawyer who went after my son for child support he couldn't possibly afford to pay. The divorce proceedings were brutal and public and expensive. My son ended up losing everything in the settlement, including the few possessions he'd managed to keep after the foreclosure and repossessions. The wealthy clients who'd been at that dinner party where I'd supposedly embarrassed my son also abandoned him immediately. Those clients weren't his personal contacts. They were company clients that I'd built relationships with over decades. When I resumed active control of the company, I personally called each of those clients and explained that my son was no longer with the firm and that I would be handling their accounts directly going forward. I also made it very clear through professional networks that my son was not to be trusted or hired by any reputable firm. His reputation in the industry was destroyed before he could even start looking for new employment. Within 6 months of throwing me out of his house, my son had lost his job, his home, his cars, his wife, his children, his clients, his reputation, and any prospect of rebuilding the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to. I'm 78 years old now, and I'm living in a comfortable penthouse apartment in the best building in the city, paid for entirely by the consulting company I built and never actually gave away to my ungrateful son. The penthouse has floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the city skyline and more space than I need, but I enjoy having it after spending 4 days sleeping under highway overpasses. I have a full-time housekeeper who keeps everything clean and organized. I have a personal chef who prepares 3 healthy meals for me every day, tailored to my heart condition and dietary needs. I'm eating better now than I have in years, certainly better than when I was living in my son's house being fed leftover scraps separately from his dinner guests. I receive excellent medical care from the best doctors in the city, all covered by the executive health insurance plan that comes with being CEO of a successful company. My heart condition is being monitored carefully, and I have regular checkups to make sure nothing dangerous develops. I take my medications on schedule without anyone complaining about the smell or treating me like a burden. I'm healthier and happier now than I was during those months living under my son's roof, feeling like an unwanted embarrassment he was stuck with. The consulting firm is doing better than ever under my leadership. Turns out my son wasn't actually as good at running things as he thought he was. Meanwhile, my son lost absolutely everything that had been built on the foundation I provided for him. He lost his high-paying job and the impressive title that came with it. He lost the mansion he'd been so proud of when the bank foreclosed on it after months of missed mortgage payments. He lost his luxury cars when they got repossessed by the leasing company. He lost his country club membership and all the social connections that came with it. He lost his wife, who filed for divorce the moment the money disappeared and took their children with her. He lost his reputation in the industry after I made it clear through professional channels that he wasn't to be trusted or hired. The last I heard from people who still have contact with him, he's living in a small apartment in a bad neighborhood, barely making rent, working some low-level job at a company that has nothing to do with consulting. He's struggling to make child support payments to his ex-wife and falling further behind every month. He's driving an old beat-up car that breaks down constantly because he can't afford repairs. He's wearing cheap clothes from discount stores and eating ramen noodles for dinner. He's experiencing exactly the kind of poverty and struggle I went through when I was young, building my business from nothing, except he doesn't have the skills or work ethic or determination to actually climb back up from rock bottom. He calls my phone sometimes from whatever number he's using now because I blocked his old one. He leaves voicemails begging for forgiveness and asking for another chance. He says he's sorry for everything he did, and he didn't understand what he had until it was gone. He asks if we can meet and talk things through like adults. He suggests maybe I could give him a lower-level position at the company just to help him get back on his feet. He promises he's changed and learned his lesson and would never treat me that way again. Some of the voicemails are angry, blaming me for destroying his life over one mistake. Others are desperate and pathetic, with him literally crying and begging for help. I don't answer any of his calls, and I don't listen to most of his voicemails. I delete them without listening as soon as I see his number. He threw me out of his house at 78 years old and made me beg strangers for food for 4 days. He treated me like garbage that needed to be disposed of because I embarrassed him in front of his wealthy friends. He physically pushed me out the door and blocked me from getting my wallet and left me to potentially die on the streets. That kind of cruelty doesn't deserve forgiveness or second chances or mercy. He made me beg for food. Now he can spend the rest of his life begging me for forgiveness he'll never receive.